Have you ever drank matcha before?
Yes.
Do you like matcha?
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I was ever trying to be somebody or if I had an idea of like who I wanted to be or what I wanted to be. The thing about working in Silicon Valley as a young engineer was that, I was there, I had a small social group, didn't really have any hobbies. Even though I maybe didn't have that experience, once I was hired, it was like, well, I must have something, right? That allowed me to get here. Like once you're in the door and you're working for a company, no one goes back and looks at your resume.
Hey guys, welcome back to It's Okay to Be Karen. Today you have me, Karen. We have yet another special guest, and his name is John Lovering. I personally am very, very excited for this episode. He actually has worked in many tech ecosystems, including Google, Apple, Lytro, Amazon, and many more. So I'm very grateful to have him on the podcast. And before I say any further, I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, so I'm John. So until recently, I've been in a lot of different tech roles. So starting out in a few different places in Silicon Valley, and then I came back to Saskatoon and did a couple of things in Saskatoon. I worked for an accounting firm for a bit. I worked for a startup here, and then recently I've been a sessional lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan. So, and now I'm also self-employed doing consulting work. So, yeah, that's me.
Very exciting. Actually, before we even get to discussions, I'm going to give you a gift card just before I forget. So this one's Rayla Cafe. They are also our sponsors. They do lots of awesome boba teas and waffles and whatnot. So great place
I know
to go.
they're by my house.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. Now you know that you can go right there.
So.
Oh, are you? Perfect. So in this segment of our podcast, we start off by doing a quick rapid fire. So essentially for the audience, a rapid fire is where I ask John 5 questions and John asks me 5 questions. There's 2 ways we can do this. I can ask you, we can alternate, or I ask you 5 and then you ask me 5 after.
Oh, you asked me 5.
I asked you 5. Okay, perfect.
I'll decide how mean I want to be from there.
Okay. Okay, first question. What is your favorite vacation destination?
Golden, British Columbia.
Okay. Are you a Tim's or a Starbucks fan?
Tim's.
Okay. Have you ever drank matcha before?
Yes.
Do you like matcha?
No.
Okay. Do you think if you were to start over and have your first job, would you do it in a startup company or in a well-established corporation?
If I started over, I'd do it the same way I did it. I'd start with a big company.
Okay. Last question. If you did not study computer science, computer engineering, what would you have studied instead?
Physics, probably.
Okay.
Oh boy. Of the professors you've had, which one has been your favorite?
You've been my favorite, but apart from you.
I'm not a professor, so.
Well, okay. I think Dr. Mondel has been my most favorite prof so far.
Planes, trains, or automobiles?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm a train girly. So now that the audience actually knows a bit more, getting into our conversations a little bit more, we'll start off with childhood, right? Because that's usually kind of the first phase where things kind of develop and start off with. So during your childhood, was there a moment when you realized you liked kind of knowing how things work, how things operated? When was that first realization that you've had?
So I'm not sure if I remember having a realization, but I have a vivid memory of taking things apart. Mm-hmm. Like if I had any kind of like electromechanical toy, it usually got taken apart, much probably to the disappointment of my parents because I didn't know how to put the things back together. So there were lots of toys I had that died because I got a hold of a screwdriver, and I think that probably stuck with me of that. Wanting to figure out how things work, wanting to get kind of into the nuts and bolts of things, and maybe the aspiration of making them better sort of was there.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going back to kind of your university life, right? Like when did you realize the major that you wanted to do was something that you wanted to pursue? I always think about picking a major kind of like a very tough decision almost, because that's kind of where a lot of people think it's kind of building off your future from. So when did you realize the major that you wanted to pick was right for you?
So I started out in engineering. So that's a little bit of a different path. And I knew I wanted to go into engineering when I was applying. Like that was really clear to me that that was the path for me for some reason when I was coming out of high school. And then at the time, and I think engineering still does this, you did a year of general engineering. So you sampled all of the different disciplines. And I kind of came down to, you know, I didn't, the ones that I liked were mechanical, electrical, and engineering physics. And I decided I probably wasn't smart enough for engineering physics. And I actually didn't do the best in electrical, but I found it the most interesting. So that's how I went that direction. And then I just kind of tumbled backward into computer science. At the time, we didn't have a computer engineering program. And in some of the electrical engineering labs, I had to do like small device programming on old school Intel, like little 8-bit microprocessors. And I really enjoyed that. And I got to meet a guy who was a few years ahead of me who was like, if you're really interested in like the programming stuff, you should look at doing a double degree. And that's how I sort of ended up tumbling back into looking at a double degree, and ultimately ending up doing a 4-year comp sci degree as well as my EE degree. So that's sort of how I ended up there. I don't think I ever thought about it in terms of like, well, what's my future going to be? I think it was always like, these are the things I'm really interested in, and these are the things I want to study. And then how do I figure out what the future is kind of, worked itself out from there.
I also feel like 20s is kind of an age, right? Like where you're trying to figure out a lot of these things. And you're kind of like pivoting through different options, figuring out what works best for you. When you were in your 20s and when you were kind of in your teens, were you trying to be someone? What did you envision yourself to be? And were you afraid of becoming someone?
Ooh,
Big question.
yeah. I'm not sure if I was ever trying to be somebody or if I had an idea of like who I wanted to be or what I wanted to be. I can't recall that being like a really motivating factor. My immediate family, there's one engineer in kind of like my aunt uncle's kind of like swath. So I don't really think that there was like a big motivation towards engineering or that stuff from that direction. I don't really have like a person I was trying to not be. There wasn't necessarily a pressure there. So I think it was there wasn't really a good like a thing I was locked onto that I was pursuing.
And because you've also been to Silicon Valley, a lot of people dream of like going there, whether they be in engineering or computer science and whatnot, right? So when you first kind of lived in Silicon Valley, when you first been there, what was the difference between what you expected and what the reality truly was?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to look at that question. So the first thing that I really noticed when I moved to California, was so I didn't live in San Francisco proper. I moved to one of the smaller cities in the South Bay. And for those of you that have been to, California or been to the South, like that area, South Bay of the San Francisco Bay is basically a bunch of Saskatoon-sized cities glued together. They're all about 150 to 200,000 people, except for like San Jose is the big anchor and San Francisco is the big anchor. But all of the other ones are kind of much smaller, and they all function as these very small cities, right? They feel very much like you're living in a small city. So like the transition into like, everyday life didn't feel that jarring, except for the fact that, I could drive 5 minutes and I'd see a sign that says you're now entering San Mateo. And I'd be like, oh, okay. That's that, like the cities are joined onto each other. So there was definitely that. In terms of working, now I'm a little bit of a black sheep in the university progression. I never did an internship, and I did work as a summer student for a startup that probably no one's ever heard of, called Celo Design Automation, and they may or may not have become Siemens. But way after my time there. But I didn't have that much in terms of like overall work experience. So like I didn't know what I was going to expect going into working for a big company. So when I went into work for a company, it just was like, everything was new to me, and I didn't have a basis for comparison. So I didn't really have any specific culture shock there. I think that I also had the opportunity to have a bunch of really interesting mentors that, showed me how to like actually navigate the corporate world that I was working in. So I think that was probably really helpful there. And there was a really interesting Canadian expat community in Apple that, was a really good support group for that. So
that's awesome. Yeah. And having been kind of living there, worked there for quite a while, what do you think were some of the teachings that you had and learnings that you had about excellence and burnout, if you were to share any?
Yeah. So I frequently reflect on Apple and my time there as really having like a lot to do with like probably both of those, but definitely in terms of excellence. And I know like people like to rag on Apple, but I worked in iPod Diag, so the group I worked for in the company, we did all of the software that tested devices before they shipped. And one of the things that was really interesting in that environment is that Apple doesn't like to accept any amount of factory escape. Mm-hmm. So they want to catch every product defect that could exist before it ever gets to a customer. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the exact number is, but Apple has a vanishingly small amount of like, you open the box, you turn on your new device and it doesn't work, mm-hmm. right? Like and that's something that they're very driven to. I remember being in a meeting where we were talking about a 0.1% yield loss on a station. And they were like, this is failing 0.1% of the time. And it was a later station on the assembly line. And of course, those of you that have done manufacturing know that the further down an assembly line you go, the more expensive it is to eat that loss. So it was a question of like, what can we do to either catch these failures earlier where they're cheaper, but also what can we change in order to stop these failures from happening? Mm-hmm. And so that was really interesting. And in other companies I went to, there was a much higher acceptance of like, if this percentage of customers gets a bad unit out of the box, that's fine. They'll just send it back and we'll replace it with a new one. Mm-hmm. And I think that Apple idea of like, you should never have that experience really stuck with me. And I think personally, I think it's probably the right idea, although I recognize the economics of doing it are quite tough. Mm-hmm. But on the flip side of that, you mentioned burnout, and not necessarily in the role I was in, but I had good friends that were, the role title was engineering project manager. And that was a burnout factory. They were always working too many hours because ultimately they were responsible for everything, but had the authority to fix nothing. Mm-hmm. So it ended up being a real powder keg for people to burn out. And the expectation was often that your phone's always on, no matter what time it rings, you answer the phone and you had to deal with things. So I got to kind of observe that, but observe the people that were actually really successful in doing that and how they managed that responsibility and what they were able to do in order to not, burn out, because it was a job that 18 months and all the faces would change, except for the 3 or 4 that somehow were able to figure out how to manage those situations. So that was really informative for sure. The thing about working in Silicon Valley as a young engineer was that, I was there, I had a small social group, didn't really have any hobbies. So like I spent an inordinate amount of time working. Just I didn't have anything else to do. So, what else are you going to do? And I think that that was, probably not the greatest, but, I was a little bit more resilient to it then. And then as I got further into my career, I started being like, no, I'm going to carve out time to do things. And I'm going to try to have this thing we call work-life balance.
Right. Yeah. And kind of going back to the university life, right? Because you've mentioned that you didn't really do an internship except working at one startup company and then actually moving to Google. Did you ever then feel any kind of imposter syndrome when you kind of stepped into those rooms with people with tons of experience?
Um, for sure. I think it was a little bit different, because when I started with Apple, I was, because of the process it took to get there, I had less imposter syndrome being there, because even though I maybe didn't have that experience, once I was hired, it was like, well, I must have something, right, that allowed me to get here.
Right.
So I didn't necessarily, once I started, and I think this would be my thing about anybody that kind of feels that way as they're starting, is like they don't have that experience, or they don't have that same experience or that rich experience, is like, once you're in the door and you're working for a company, no one goes back and looks at your resume, right? So it's about what you're bringing to the table every day, not what you had, right? So those experiences are generally really good for getting you those interviews, but they're not great for passing those interviews. Well, they might be great for passing those interviews if you had a really good experience and you can share lots about it, but ultimately getting through an interview and getting hired and being effective at the job is going to be what you're bringing. So you can still bring that even if you don't have that experience, that background. If you haven't done, a ton of internship, it's still possible.
And I remember at the rapid fire round, you did say that if you were given an option between a startup and a corporation, and if you were kind of to do it all over again, you would still start with a corporation. Is there a reason why you would say that?
Yeah. So when I thought about that question, the what occurred to me is that big corporations teach structure of how to make decisions. They build, as a corporation grows, it has to build processes. It has to build ways of figuring things out, and it also has to build ways of managing people and directing people. And understanding those processes is really, really important, because one of the things I often see when I look at startups is there's a lot of chaos, right? And so for me, I think, well, if people learn these processes by going through that sort of time in an environment that's going to build that, then you have a better ability to understand when the chaos is necessary chaos for startup growth, because startups have to be chaotic, because everybody has 15 hats they have to wear, right? That's going to happen. That's the nature of that. But understanding when that is not productive, or when you need to start employing better systems, like really concretely, when you look at startups, a lot of times they come in and they don't have good structure. Like, software companies don't have good structure of how to deliver their software. And if you don't know that it can be good, you wouldn't know when you've reached a point to seek out a better solution. When do we need to build CI/CD? When do we need to build larger test infrastructure? All of these pieces, it's harder to know exactly when that breakover is, because it's theoretical if you're coming at it from, straight out of school, where you've maybe encountered it in sort of a, 371 simulated environment, versus actual, how do you deploy code? How do you actually build something and deploy it into production for people to use, sort of environment?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, right? Because I feel like usually with a startup, if you don't have prior experience, you're almost coming in with a blank slate. Whereas if you've worked in corporation, you kind of have that basic understanding of, what to expect, how it should be ideally, or what those processes should actually look like. Since you've worked in, let's say, Amazon, Google, Lightro now, and if you were kind of to look back at some of those experiences that you've had, what do you think are some of those stories that have shaped you to be the engineer or the person that you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of stories. Yeah, just an absolute ton of them. I think, you know, I can probably extract one or two from each place. I just don't know how much time you have for me to tell stories.
Tell me one exciting
Um,
story.
yeah, so I'll link back to the burnout piece,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a story from when I was at Google, and part of the job that I had throughout my career is I did on-site factory support, so I frequently had to travel into Asia, primarily mainland China, to support ongoing build activities, and there was a build when I was working on Pixel Buds with Google, where no, it wasn't Pixel Buds. It was a project that didn't ever ship, so I can't actually name what it was.
Okay.
But we were working on this project that didn't ever ship, and we went over, and there was a guy who was a fixture engineer, so he was working on the test fixtures, and me and my my buddy Stan Review, who's also a U of S grad, we're there and we're walking down the line, and frequently when you're a small team supporting a build, if you don't have anything to do, you go and walk, you look for problems, right? So we're walking down the line and we see like this guy, and he's, it's looking like he's struggling. It's really
Right. Yeah.
stressed out. Things don't seem to be working. And we're like, hey, let's go over, rubber duck this problem, right? Hey, what's happening? And he's talking about, he's doing, and it's a camera test. And he's like, this is the target. This is what it should look like. This is what I'm getting. It doesn't make any sense. Like nothing lines up. I don't understand how the results can be so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And, after a little bit of chatting with this guy, we found out like he's been at this, working on not this specific problem, but working on this setup for like, he's going on like 12 hours, 13 hours. And he did like 14 hours the day before, and 14 hours the day before that. So this guy is tired, super burnt, like he's burning out.
Mm-hmm.
And Stan looks at the screen, and he looks at the fixture, and he goes, kind of looks like the unit is in the corner, not in the middle.
Right.
Like, is is that right? And the guy just kind of like face palms, and he's like, pushes the two green buttons, and the unit moves to the middle, and all the tests pass.
Oh, there you
So
go.
how long had he sat there just pulling his hair out because, he has, smart guy. Like I met this guy in a bunch of other contexts, really smart guy.
Yeah.
But, just was dumb because he was so tired at that point. And we kind of started to implement a policy of like, the bus leaves at, right? Because we'd have a bus that would pick us up and take us back to the hotel. And we're like, the bus leaves at 8 p.m. You're getting on the bus.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one's staying here until midnight. We're all going home.
Yeah.
The problems will still be here tomorrow. We'll
Right.
solve them tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of, I haven't backed this up with science, and I'm sure there is science that backs it up, but I have this theory of like, the thing about 12 or longer hour days is you can do them once. And if you do a 12-hour day once, you get 4 extra hours of work.
Mm-hmm.
If you do a second 12-hour day, you only get about 2 extra hours of work because you're slower throughout the day.
Yeah.
If you try a third time, now you're batting par, right? You're getting 12 hours of work for 14 hours or whatever, 16, 8 hours of work for 12 hours of time committed. If you go on further, you start losing. You start getting only 6 hours of work, but you did 12 hours because your acuity is going down. So, you have to kind of like think like a marathoner, right? Like marathoners don't sprint.
Right.
They maybe run at near a sprint when they can see the goal line, and they know that they have just enough left to get across that goal line. But, that was a really interesting sort of piece for me, is just, watching somebody who is just clearly struggling because they've been working too hard.
No, that's such a good story, right? Because usually I think with software engineers or software developers, we tend to like sit for hours and hours to kind of figure out what the problem is, when all you really need to do is just speak to someone who might just know what the problem is, right?
Or sometimes just get up and go for a walk.
Yes, yeah,
right.
100%.
The go for a walk. I mean, my buddy Anthony Arkles, who is also U of S grad, and worked with him a little bit. He used to joke that like 50% of the time you can replace the help desk at the comp sci with a rubber duck. like someone could just go and talk to the rubber
Yeah.
duck and
The
that it
problem
would
solved.
solve their problem, because
Yeah.
most of the time the issue is they need to get up and disconnect from the problem for a second and talk it through or something. But
Yeah. No, absolutely. I
you
agree.
get so stuck in your what are we doing?
Mm-hmm. Mm. Also, kind of going back to your Silicon Valley kind of experience there, what made you actually come back to the province? That's, I think, a very curious topic.
Oh, yeah. So I don't know the alignment of your audience. So there's a couple of reasons. I always give this as there's several reasons. One, I was working for Google, and so I'm going to be careful here. I don't want to get myself in too much trouble.
Okay.
But Google at the time struggled to ship hardware. So I mentioned I was that story came from a project that never shipped. I actually worked on 4 different projects at Google, and 3 of them never shipped.
Okay.
And kind of notoriously, what would happen in our product cycles is we would design, we would do all of the initial stuff, and we would get to a point where in hardware cycles, there's a point in the process where you have to build expensive tooling. It's just a part of what you have to do as the next step. And that's where projects would invariably die, because the financing structure at Google required more people to sign off on it because of how much it was going to cost. And that meant convincing several different leaders that this was a good project, that was worthwhile. And invariably, somebody wouldn't be convinced, so the project wouldn't make it through. So that was sort of a challenge. So as we finished Pixel Buds, the team I worked for didn't have any projects. And it wasn't clear whether or not we had any projects. And the projects that seemed to be brewing were kind of like more headphone type projects, and wasn't super interested in them. So I started to get to a point where I was like, well, maybe I should start looking for something new, right? Maybe this is the time to move on. And it was at a time where, they had just elected a certain president in the United States. And one of the things that certain president had said was that they were going to tear up NAFTA. And my work authorization was a TN1 visa, which was a NAFTA free trade visa. So I was like, well, I might not have work authorization, and I'm thinking of getting a new job. So those were kind of like big tent poles of like, it might make sense for me to relocate. And then the third one, which should probably be the first one, but I always forget to put it first, but then I remember, is that I have a long-term partner who we had been long distance the entire time I worked in the US. And part of the reason for that is that she looked at me and said very respectfully, I didn't go to university and also get a degree, 2 degrees, in fact, to not be able to do anything. And if she had come and lived with me, that would be the extent of what she would be allowed to do, because the visa program I was on wouldn't have permitted a spouse to work. So that made sense. I was like, yeah, I get that. She wanted to do productive things with her education. So we'd been long distance for a long time. And at some point you kind of got to decide what you're going to do. And so I had these 2 other good reasons to move back. So that sort of was like, well, I guess I'll move back. Right? Like that seemed like a good juncture to return.
And did you ever consider to go back?
Like since moving back here?
Yeah.
Never seriously. I've, every so often I've looked, but I think that it would be tough to make that transition back again. I think that, yeah, I would like the work. I think that I would go back and work for Apple again, but I don't. I mean, one, I don't know whether or not they would hire me back, so I can't be like egotistical and go, oh yeah, they would hire me. I would if that was an opportunity, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I'd want to live in
Mhm.
California again full time. I think
Right.
that would be. I think I like
Where you are
living
at
here.
the moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a. There's a couple of things that I like about
Right.
being here that
Mhm.
I but there are definitely things I miss about living in California.
Yeah, and I
You,
also think we're at like different phases of life, right? You have different priorities. I feel like when you're between your 20s to 30s, there's something else that you're prioritizing. As you get older, you prioritize some other stuff,
yeah,
right? So that makes
for
sense.
sure. I
Mhm.
can't do the California triathlon here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fair.
ski, windsurf, and whatever.
Yeah. And when you kind of move back here to the province, is there something about the tech ecosystem that you've noticed in the province that's very different from, let's say, the Silicon Valley?
Yes and no. When I first moved back, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the when I first moved back, that would have been 2018, I guess, at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So the tech ecosystem was kind of just getting a footing. And so it was definitely not as fast paced, not as funding focused.
Mm-hmm.
It felt a lot more deliberate at the time as how people were moving through tech. We've seen that change a little bit as the world has got smaller with globalization. As some big notable players have pulled in more and more funding. We've seen VCs be more and more interested. At for many years, it was like a company from Saskatoon was basically going to struggle if they needed to get funded.
Mm-hmm.
They had to make a presence in
Mm-hmm.
Silicon Valley, because the companies out there, or the VCs out there, just were like, well, we don't think anybody can make it if you're not here,
Right.
right? And notably there were some exceptions, but
Mm-hmm.
even those companies kind of went through a program in Silicon Valley to sort of, establish themselves. So for a long time, that was really true. Now I think we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot more access to capital, but
Right.
I think that's also come with a push towards our tech ecosystem converging towards what those tech ecosystems look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we see a lot more of the move fast, I like language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those things, and I'm not sure necessarily that we need to do that. I mean, I'm not a tech founder, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a successful tech founder, so my opinion may not matter in this space. But I also am like, look, I am kind of the belief that if you find a problem to solve, and it's an interesting problem to solve, and you have a way to solve that problem that no one else has thought of yet,
Mm-hmm.
that you can still, you don't have to move at lightning speed.
Mm-hmm.
My belief is the only reason everyone has to move at lightning speed is because they don't have anything that makes them defensible. So the only thing they can do is get there first, right?
Right.
You have to be the first mover if there's nothing else you can do to protect your technology.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've solved a problem in a space or in a way that no one else is seeing, and something I've advocated before is, if you're doing so in a way that Silicon Valley is blind to, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're what they call a small to medium sized city,
Mm-hmm.
which means that we have a very unique scope of problems. And there's more Saskatoons than there are San Franciscos. So, looking globally, so there's this suite of problems that we can understand here, that most people in Silicon Valley actually don't understand why that problem exists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an interesting spot there for us to solve those kind of problems.
Mm-hmm. And how far do you think like we as a province are from being a global tech leader?
Um, Global tech leader.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a steep hill to climb,
Yeah.
right? Like, once you add the globe in there, it's like there's a lot of places that are doing really interesting things globally.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say we're pretty far from global. I
Mm-hmm.
think that there are definitely things that Saskatoon can be a unique player in, and to kind of my point before, in those spaces that we can see and solve that maybe other places can't. I think there's niches that we could be a leader in. I think it would be hard to see a future. I mean, and I love Saskatoon, so don't get me wrong here, but I think it's hard to see a future where it's like we're a powerhouse that's, batting against, Silicon Valley, or, in Canada against Vancouver or Toronto, right? Like, I think it would be difficult for us to build that degree of tech prowess, but I think that there are definitely spaces where we can be the expert leaders in.
And kind of touching a little bit with you being a lecturer at the university, when that kind of came towards your plate or kind of came forth towards you, what made you said yes to the position?
So the reason I became a lecturer is, so I was originally asked to help support 332, so operating systems, and that was really interesting to me, and I enjoyed that experience, and I kind of was like, hey, do you have any other spaces that need support? And so I ended up taking on teaching 141, and then following that, I applied to teach 214 as a summer course, and so like the original reason I took on 332 was, I thought, well, this would be kind of interesting, and I think I would enjoy doing this, but taking on 214, and that's where I've spent probably most of my time teaching, was a unique opportunity for me because, and I say this without irony, 214 is probably the one class where I learned things that I used almost every single day. 332, you learn things that you will absolutely use if you're in that kind of space, and working in those spaces. But you're not necessarily going to have to, solve concurrency semaphore problems on a regular basis. But when you need to know how to do it. 214 is the set of tools which it's like every single problem you need to solve, you're probably going to have to pull out a tool that hopefully you learned in 214. And I remember that being very true for me, is that one of the things that allowed me to be successful in my first, couple of months or years of my career was that, I had built up this ability to identify and learn tools from doing 214. And so I really wanted to be able to contribute that back to a new generation of students, in that, like, this is the thing that actually is going to be the piece that you need, right? You need to be able to do these things because you will be doing them regularly.
Right. And I feel like it's always kind of a trade-off, but how do you balance the two aspects? One being kind of inspiring students, but the other aspect being kind of being very truthful about what the industry and what the reality is. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's tough. What I would say is that I have found that the students that are actually interested in pursuit of the career and of the craft, the stories of what's actually happening in the industry are inherently kind of inspiring. There's those students I generally find are not scared of that, right? They're studying computer science because they have a real interest in in learning that, and then the application, the things that kind of come later. The students that tend to find that disheartening, often to me seem to be the students who have chosen computer science for a monetary reason, that they are looking at computer science as a pathway to a different set of goals, and they're much more concerned about how am I going to be employable in the future, as this industry changes and as how these other things change. So I think the balance I try to strike is that, I don't want to be unrealistic about what's happening in the industry, But I actually find if we're actually realistic about what's
Mm-hmm.
happening, especially when I say everybody's favorite boogeyman, which is AI, when we actually look at
Mm-hmm.
what we're actually seeing happening,
Mm-hmm.
there's it actually reinforces that there's still a place for those students that have really put in that effort to have that mastery.
Mm-hmm.
That's the skill that's actually the important part that
Mm-hmm.
you need. And if you don't have that part, that's the part that's going to be a problem, right? You know, we have reached the point where being able to just program is not necessarily the skill that
Mm-hmm.
employers are looking for. And you know, that means that having something else, having that architectural understanding, those deeper level pieces,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually the part that's going to be the important skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that students that are hungry for that knowledge, who are really interested in
Mm-hmm.
getting computers to do stuff for purely the joy of that, do still find that reality to be interesting, and looking at what can they learn and what can they pursue in order to fit into that world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of my
When we kind of talk about university students, what do you think are some of the advices would you give to those young engineers, young computer scientists who have misconceptions about what the industry truly is?
yeah. So my big advice in that, and I tried this a little bit. I taught 214 in the spring session,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, the reality that I think is that you have to learn these things because you want to learn the craft, right? Um, if you're just looking at this as a skill set that you're learning, that that might not be enough. And so I think what I would say is, yeah, like focus on what is the craft, how do I make myself better,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how does this fit into that, right? And be hungry for that knowledge. And I think that's what I would really say, is that, a well-rounded, especially in computer science, but a well-rounded grad in computer science isn't somebody that can write JavaScript, write Java,
Mm-hmm.
write Python, write, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the skill set. The skill set is, there's somebody who is fluent in the thinking and design of programs, and therefore they can learn almost any of those languages, right? A good computer scientist, that the language is just an interface between the fundamental design and the how do you get the computer to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the middle layer.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you've developed this skill, you can learn any number of interfaces. And famously, myself, I'm one of the guys I went to school with. Every year we like to do Advent of Code, but we do Advent of Code in a programming language we have never used before,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, there's this whole element of like learning how that language implements different paradigms and approaches. But, most of the time it's like, oh, I need a for loop. What does a for loop look like in this language, right?
Yeah.
How can I implement this kind of pattern in this language?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, that piece is still going to be important. Even if, AI is able to do these things, you still have to be able to guide the paradigm and the design, right? Right now, our current level of these like AI large language systems, they can't translate intent very well. They require a lot heavier process. And, there's people who are building those kind of systems. I went to a really interesting talk from Dave Khalil, and he talked about this like massive system he's built to basically do engineering, proper requirements, design, detailed design with AI agents, like with AI processes. But he has basically built an entire engineering process to facilitate that. And he can get really good results because he's putting in that work. But to be able to design that process and understand that process and run that process required the engineering knowledge, the systems knowledge, all of those pieces to be able to know how to like guide what that system has to look like. And so that's where I think that computer science grads should be hardened, is that, you know, there is evidence of that. In recent news, we've also seen like all of the layoffs have basically, there's been a huge rollback of layoffs, and, you know, everyone was laying everybody off because, you know, Claude was taking your job. And then all of those companies have recently started hiring back a lot of those people, because it turns out Claude wasn't very good at doing that job, right? And we can look at the heat maps of like how much downtime websites have had, and, you know, the AI adoption trend and layoff was strongly correlated to a huge drop in uptime. Like GitHub was like, they were going for 3 nines, right? 90.99 as opposed to 99.9, which used to be the standard for SaaS products, right? So, you know, I think we've seen that there's still a huge need for that institutional knowledge and people who have that ability to think about those design processes.
If you were to kind of look at your career kind of so far, and if you had to describe what growth means to you today versus what it looks like maybe 20 years ago, how would you define growth today?
Oh, that's really tough, because I think I personally struggle with that at this stage in my career. As to like what does it look like for me in terms of growth, and how I fit into a lot of those pieces. Recently, because I've moved into more of a consulting role, you know, growth, I'm not necessarily in a like skill growth phase. I'm a lot more in a phase of like matching skills I have to companies. Earlier on in my career, I would say that like growth was a lot about, you know, skill acquisition, knowledge acquisition, becoming competent in different areas, being able to say that I can do X, Y, and Z, right? And I think now I'm at a stage where I'm not sure how many of those things are well, there's literally millions of things that I don't know how to do. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert, but I'm not sure necessarily what those things are and what to pursue. So I think it's definitely, it becomes fuzzier as you go further. It also becomes fuzzier when you're not in a structured environment where it's clear what you need to do in order to build growth.
Right. And if you were to kind of take this podcast as kind of a platform, and if you had to say anything to anybody, whoever's watching, what would you say to them?
But yeah, I mean, I think that the area I've been circling around is like, be curious, be like interested in things, pursue things because you have genuine interest in them. You know, find something that you are genuinely interested in, and go and pursue that. Especially if you're a student, go and study things that you think are really interesting, because it will give you more enjoyment than trying to figure out right now what that career path looks like. Because in my lifetime so far, there has always been, oh, you'll never be able to get a degree with X, you should study Y. You'll never be able to get a degree with Y, or job with Y, you should study Z, right? There's always been something that was the better thing to go and get as a degree program for your success. And I think that we're really bad oracles, and those are frequently wrong. Right. And I worked with an amazing programmer who had a degree in geology. I've worked with an amazing programmer who had no degree, who just was really good at understanding things. Right. So, like, I think that there's not necessarily a correlation in terms of that. Right. Study what you're interested in, and then you can go from there in terms of figuring out how to find a place for that. As you pursue, as you get further along.
I want to say, John, this was an awesome podcast. I personally, as a host, I want to say this is one of the best podcasts I've ever had.
Oh boy.
So thank you so much for actually saying yes to the podcast.
Oh no.
being
fun.
here and for sharing so much about yourself. I think to the audience, I just want to one more time want to say thank you, John, for being very, very authentic and being your true self. I think the students who have been in your classes, they're probably going to learn more about you through this podcast. And I'm hoping that whoever watches can be at least 1% of who you are and what you've done so much in your life so far. With that being said, I'm going to tell the audience, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave it at the bottom of this podcast video, and John and I will help to co-reply because we're awesome. And with that being said, we're just going to say bye.